Thanks, Faye. Pleasure to be here. Honored to be sharing this information that we've learned from 10 years at Zendo Project within MAPS. And yeah, I'm just excited. Thanks all for joining us live, and thanks for all of you viewing this as a recording for being here and taking in this information. So let's get started. All right. So, yeah, let me start you off by giving you all a little background on myself and the organization that I call home. I work for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and Zendo Project, which has been a division and is now its own independent business unit and nonprofit. Zendo Project provides psychedelic peer support at Burning Man festivals and other concerts and events. And we also do a public education around psychedelic peer support. I got involved in this work in 2013 and have just been, yeah, really passionate about it ever since. To back up a little bit from that, my initiation into this work, I guess for just relevancy, not to brag, none of this has anything to, no timeline or anything that I have has anything to do with any of the other amazing people doing it. I just want to share with you a little bit about my journey. I got involved with psychedelics back in 1995. The DARE program was extremely successful on me. I didn't have any inclination to try any of these things until I really researched them. 1998 was my first psychedelic conference, and in 2008 I went down to Peru for my first ayahuasca dieta after doing that with a community in California for several years. And that's really what got me into Zendo, which was that during that dieta I had a delirium as part of our plant mixture, and I had a sleep deprivation that created a psychotic break. And it was a really rough few weeks for myself and the team that brought me home safely. And it has informed my work of how to support acute and difficult psychedelic experiences from the Zendo Project ever since I discovered them in 2013. So that's a little bit more about me. I'll share my contact info at the end of this. If anyone wants to reach out to me personally and hear more about that experience, I'm absolutely open to sharing. So our agenda for today, it's a lot of information that we're going to squeeze into a very short period of time. And I believe that this is some of the most important stuff that we can talk about when it comes to not just psychedelics, but psilocybin specifically. Some of the information that I'll be sharing is pretty dense in terms of its slide and text on a screen. I want you all to know that this slideshow will be available for your use after we finish here. So in terms of taking notes or feeling like you've missed any of the information, this slideshow will be available as a PDF. So we're going to dive into harm reduction. We're going to talk challenges, which are not the same as emergencies, which we'll address next. And then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits and maximization of your lifelong journey through support and integration. So I usually speed read this thing in 3 or 4 minutes, but given the shorter time we have here, I'm just going to say that no drug is completely safe for all people at all times, at all dosages, and the content of this course is provided for informational purposes only. If there is any emergency, please seek mental or other medical professional support immediately. All right, so harm reduction. And psilocybin harm reduction specifically. So the idea of harm reduction applies to everything from seatbelts to bicycle helmets to condoms, just reducing the harm that is possibly inherent with an activity. So specifically around drugs, it refers to the programs and policies that aim to minimize negative health. Whether that's social or legal impacts associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. It's grounded in human rights, focusing on positive change and working with people without judgment, coercion, discrimination, or requiring that they stop using drugs as a precondition of support. So again, this is just making a differentiation between harm reduction and an abstinence-based policy. I think for most of us that grew up here in the United States, both sex education and drug education were just don't do it. That didn't work out for most of us. And so the idea of harm reduction and actually educating ourselves through open and honest dialogues about the risks associated with and how we can reduce those risks, I think are a real key, especially at this time and age. So jumping in here to psychedelics. This term psychedelic means mind manifesting, and it was coined by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. You might have seen his quote before: "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." So there is a bigger and broader term of psychedelics that we'll be talking about, and I'm sure has been informed by many of the other speakers, both today and tomorrow. But what I want to specifically aim at is that within this giant field of psychedelics and, well, let me back up, in this giant field of harm reduction, we are specifically looking at psychedelic harm reduction. And the work that we do at Zindo Project even narrows that slice even more to psychedelic peer support. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, both the harm reduction behind drug use and psychedelic use, as well as how to support yourself and others through difficult psychedelic journeys. So one of the biggest pieces, and maybe I don't want to say the only takeaway, but if there is one takeaway from this presentation today that may help you, your friends, your family, your community be reminded of why psychedelics can be so difficult and how we might reduce some of the risks associated behind psychedelics, is to remember this phrase right here: psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier. So specifically for any of you who have never taken psychedelics in your lifetime, or maybe did psychedelics at one point or have tried microdosing, there's a huge difference between, say, a microdose of psilocybin and a threshold or heroic dose. And even more so for those of us that have maybe done a variety of drugs in our life, psychedelics are not the same as cocaine, alcohol, even though marijuana on some level is a very real psychedelic. It's a different journey. So again, psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier. So just the reminder that set and setting are really everything. So we'll get a little deeper into that, but the reminder that if you're having a hard time and think psychedelics are the way out, psychedelics are going to take that hard time that's happening inside your mind or your heart and amplify them. If there are repressed memories that you don't know about, psychedelics are going to bring them up. Psychedelics, the other piece, and again, this isn't our phrase up here, but the reminder is psychedelics bring the unconscious to the conscious mind. So anything from repressed trauma to memories that we don't even know we have can be and often are revealed. And this is a lot of what we see at our work within the Zindo Project, is folks are taking these things to have a good time, and they're coming out the other side dealing with things that they didn't even know were up for them. So again, we'll dive into this, but the pieces that I want to encourage for all of us as we think about how we can make the most optimal experience within psilocybin are to remind ourselves about setting, and support. So set is that mindset, the internal, what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our hearts and our minds, how we're feeling, what our internal setting looks like. External being the environment, the conditions going on in the world, with our friends, with our families, the outside thing. And finally, support being that bigger arc, not just the support that you may ask for during your psilocybin experience, but the support of people helping you to prepare, helping you to integrate, the support of folks even helping you to source some of these materials that are, again, we'll get into that question, where do I find these things? we'll talk about that. So as we develop some of this coursework at MAPS, and I'll encourage all of you, there's an amazing psychedelic fundamentals course at MAPS. It doesn't dive into all of this with the same depth, but we are doing this modularly. So I encourage you, if what you see in the fundamentals course seems too basic because maybe you're an experienced psychonaut, keep checking back. There's some really amazing content that we're developing and releasing in the months and years to come. But within that development, we kind of, I don't want to say we pioneered this. This is borrowing from some of the other work around the psychedelic community, but looking at the 9 S's within the psychedelic context. So beyond set and setting, what's the substance? What's the actual psychedelic? In this case, we're talking about psilocybin, but what's the dose? What's the route of administration? What are the supplies, the other equipment and materials that you have available to you during the experience? This next one is a really big one that I encourage all of us to remind ourselves and examine before we even consider going into this headspace with others. Who are the other folks that participating in the experience? What are our relationships with them? Are these folks that we know, that we trust, that we feel safe in this level of vulnerability? Sitter, the folks looking out after or guiding people on a trip. Support, so the folks that are there assisting before, during, and after the trip. And session, so like the time of from the trip takeoff to the landing. And I also like to remind folks, in any session, give yourself a day before for preparation and a day after for integration. And finally, the situation. So the entire context for everything from the integration, the trip itself, and where you may find yourself. So this slide has a lot of information on it. And again, I encourage you to review it as you see this in a PDF. I just want to present that there is a huge spectrum of effects. Again, psilocybin and psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. They bring the unconscious to the conscious. So there is a variety of things that can happen from positive to neutral to negative. Because we're talking about harm reduction and risk here, I'm going to spend a lot more time diving into the more negative aspects of what can happen on psilocybin. I'm sure there are plenty of other speakers talking about the amazing therapeutic benefits, but these are the things that I want us to remind ourselves and our community as we look at maybe taking psilocybin for the first time, or supporting others, or taking it for the 100th time. Again, these are some of the things medically and psychiatrically to be aware of. Do not consume psilocybin or any other psychedelic while taking an MAO inhibitor. People with schizophrenia, history of bipolar, or other psychotic disorders or suicidal thoughts are encouraged to not take psychedelics or psilocybin. Some encouragements: lower doses, decrease potential risks. No matter how experienced you may be, anxiety is a common part of the experience, especially in the early stages. And there's a lot of temperature sensitivity. So being able to find yourself in a comfortable environment of about 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit may eliminate some of the stuff, and having appropriate clothing, blankets, etc. if you're going to be outside. So we're going to dive into challenges. And again, I'm going to distinguish the difference between what's a challenge, which we're going to cover here in this next session, with what's an emergency. And we will differentiate between the two as we dive in here. So the idea of a challenge is something that may be difficult to deal with, but doesn't require the scope of professional mental health, medical health, or law enforcement professionals to walk us through. So some of these challenges, I think, can be a really beautiful reminder, especially to folks that are doing psychedelics, and specifically psilocybin, for the first time, or considering, is psilocybin right for me? Now, again, I'm going to be a little bit of the person here reminding us that maybe not. You know, I imagine there are a lot of other speakers that are going to be encouraging and reminding you that this is the right time and this is the right substance and medicine, and there can be all sorts of ways in. And I'm not in disagreement. I just want to provide a counterpoint to say that if the idea of being out of control, of taking a lifetime of belief systems or understandings of how you plug into the political or social system of your life and turning it on your head seems disorienting or scary, this might not be the right experience for you. It is not uncommon for even experienced psychonauts to find themselves reassessing the way that they have seen the world through a insight, a epiphany, things like that during their psilocybin journeys. The other things that happen are some amount of self-reflection, whether that's a memory or recognizing the impact that our actions and behaviors have had on others. That can provide, or it can provide insight, but it can also sometimes be traumatizing. So that reminder that if looking at those parts of ourselves doesn't feel, well, let me say it this way, it's not fun. So if that doesn't feel like something that you're ready to sign up for, or the people that you are here to support to sign up for, there are other ways to do this. There are things like holotropic breathwork and alternatives to psilocybin that can provide a similar psychedelic experience, but also provide a easier way out. The reminder, as we talk about in Zendo Project, and we'll get to this in a later slide, is there is no out. Once you've gotten on the ride, it's like being on a roller coaster. You're not going to get off the ride until you're back at the station. You're not going to get off mid loop-de-loop because it's scary. So the idea that you're going through the whole arc can be a difficult thing. The idea that there's going to be trauma possibly brought into the mind and heart of what you're experiencing. That could be your own personal trauma, but it can often be beyond you. It can be ancestral. It can be something that you've inherited from your lineage, or it can even be planetary. Discovering that there's a lot of suffering going on in this world right now. And this reminder in the psychedelic, the psilocybin headspace, that some of this trauma comes up as either us being direct victims or perpetrators of the trauma that we're seeing play out. Again, talking about loss of control, the amount of confusion, disorientation, delusions of grandeur, and inability to communicate wants or needs or what's going on inside of yourself, it can be a really hard thing for some folks. And then emotional, there can be anxiety, there can be despair, screaming, crying, agony. In addition to all these fun spiritual and mental challenges that come up, there's some part of this that can be physical. So everything from headaches to nausea to feeling wobbly. I will say from my own experience, unlike any other psychedelic, psilocybin seems, especially at higher doses, to have this interesting effect of making me weak in the knees. Now, I'm going to give my personal plug on this. I think there is some sort of communication that wants to be given to us as human beings to say, look, you don't need to walk anywhere. You just need to lay down, sit, but maybe lay down because we need to have a conversation with you. We being the psilocybin molecule or the plant spirit. I've found across the folks that we supported, there's a lack of coordination on higher doses, sensitivity to lights and sound, and just a general discomfort of being human. Big loss of appetite can happen, impaired vision, and lots of bathroom trips. So if you all are not familiar with the psychedelic poops, it's kind of a reality across the board of most psychedelics create a need to move things through the system more often than we would find ourselves going to the bathroom in any other state or on other types of drugs. I'm not going to go through all of these again, but these are some experiences that we've seen in the Zendo and are not uncommon within the psychedelic landscape. So everything from reliving births, accidents, illness, drowning, torture, and experiences from this and other lifetimes, mystical states, merging with rocks, plants, and animals, merging with peoples, reading their minds, feeling their emotions, being caught in certain experiences over and over, which we call looping, or finding yourselves overwhelmed by feelings and emotions. Again, some of these can be really fun. They can be really awe-inspiring and a reminder of the beauty of life, but they can also be really scary. So through this, the idea of, these other risks, once again, I'm going to state this for our liability, but more just the encouragement as we're having these conversations. There have been research into the idea of psychedelics and schizophrenia back in the 50s and 60s, of this maybe being an insight of what people with schizophrenia or other mental differences, or how do we say it? Eluding me, but the idea again that we are encouraging as MAPS and Zendo Project that people with schizophrenia, bipolar, or other psychotic disorders, or especially folks with suicidal thoughts, should just avoid taking any psychedelics, period. There are other ways to get help, therapy, to work through things. Psychedelics are not necessarily the answer for this group. So, some other simple reminders for psychedelic harm reduction. And I know some of these seem maybe ridiculous to those of you that have never been in these states, or maybe are veterans, but there's a strange tendency in these head states to forget or sometimes dismiss the ordinary associations that we have with potentially dangerous objects, behaviors, or situations. So fire burns, water drowns, knives are sharp. And if you think you can fly, start from the ground floor. It's where the ducks do it. They don't take the elevator to the top floor, right? And again, I'm bringing back up these 9 S's of psychedelic context because any one of these not properly addressed can be a risk, right? If we don't have the proper supplies like water or a compass or anything out, if we're going on a simple hike, if we haven't taken the time to look at our sojourners, the other people participating in this experience, that can be a risk. The substance itself, the dose, the route of administration, we'll get into that, can be a risk. So I want to ask all of you, and this is a very important piece, and I imagine some of this will be addressed by some of the other speakers, but when you think about support, when you think about sojourners, and especially for a lot of folks that we've seen in this movement get turned on to the mainstreaming of psychedelics and the urgency of finding somebody to sit for them or be their shaman or their guide, ask yourself, would you trust this person? Alone and unsupervised, with your pet, with your child, with your spouse, with your family or friends? If no, you shouldn't be doing psychedelics with them. And you certainly shouldn't be asking them to hold space for you to be in some of the most vulnerable places you may ever find yourself in your life. So think of an individual in psychedelic crisis as a sick toddler. That individual might be you, or it might be the person you're supporting, unable to communicate, unable to express their needs in a way that's comprehensible, not able to give appropriate feedback, but they're clearly hurting and they need help. So if you find yourself in that place, thinking of yourself or the people that you love as a sick toddler, are you finding trustworthy people to support you through these difficulties? My recommendation, whether you're talking about sojourners or support, is to spend as much time outside of psychedelic headspace getting to know this person. Go out for tea, go for a walk in a park or a hike, have a few Zoom phone calls, get to know who this person is, get to know their heart, get to understand what values you share and overlap together, because these are important things. Just in the same way you don't necessarily jump into bed with the first person you meet, you don't want to jump into ceremony or psychedelic therapy with the first sitter you come across. So it doesn't mean that this person, if it doesn't fit, is a bad person. It just could be a bad fit. So the idea with all of this stuff, with our sojourners, with our support, is resonance, is getting one another and being in a place of ease and good communication and integrity and shared values. These are the things that we see in the Zendo Project. So many of the folks that come into us are there because they had a hard time with their campmates. And I mean, beautifully, sometimes these are experienced psychonauts taking MDMA together or psilocybin, and they're looking at their friend who's inexperienced and having their first journey, and they're going through hell. They're releasing some bit of emotion that is uncomfortable for these experienced psychonauts, so they drop them off at the Zendo Project for us to babysit, which we happily do. But the idea that if there wasn't a Zendo Project to drop somebody off on, would you want to be around somebody that's telling you that your tears or your joy or your anger are unwelcome? I think this is the bigger piece before we dive into the world of psilocybin, is really creating safety amongst humans in sobriety. So we're going to talk a little bit here about sourcing and dose. Now, I'm not Paul Stamets, and I'm not a mycologist. So my first recommendation to all of you about harvesting mushrooms is don't harvest mushrooms. If you are not an experienced mycologist, if you don't have a field guide, there's a lot of lookalikes. There's a lot of poisonous and deadly mushrooms out there. Just don't risk it. There are other ways to source. And I imagine there are some amazing speakers talking about everything from the psilocybin grow kits that you can get by asking for syringes and doing all sorts of things. Check the web. There's some great things to do, or great places to explore to find ways where you can grow your own psilocybin. Some places you can do that legally. Some places you're in a gray or maybe even a very illegal place, but that's up to your own ethics of how you choose to go ahead with that. The other piece is if you are sourcing from someone else, know that source. Make sure it's a trusted source. And the other piece that we're going to dive into here is dosage. So as we look at dose here, I know we're hitting microdose. I can't remember what the speaker is, but I know that's something that's being covered here. People are talking about microdosing. And from a lot of my personal experience, as well as the folks that I've talked to, microdosing can be incredibly helpful. And I almost want to recommend that as the starting point for anybody who's curious about this medicine, as opposed to having bigger doses. So the idea of a microdose is 0.05 or less to about 0.15, or a little higher than that. That's where things start becoming a threshold. Again, this is different for everybody. It depends not only on your body weight, but it depends on how your neurological chemistry works. There are folks that I know that can do 4 or 5 grams without feeling much. There are other folks that I know that do a gram and they're just on the floor and in another world where, other people are on that same strain and that same, dose and having a very light experience. So just this idea that, that the common, 1 to 2.5 grams is more that place of being over the threshold of experiencing, the onset and the feeling of the psilocybin, and strong being anything over 2.5 grams. Terence McKenna talked about 5 or more dried grams being a heroic dose. From my limited experience of having done that once, I don't know what other words to put to it, but it is a different experience. I will reference at the end of the slideshow another man, Kalindi Ai, who unfortunately passed away, bless his soul, over COVID. I got to meet the man at an amazing event in Pittsburgh, and his big doses ranged from 10 to 40 dried grams. Nothing I would recommend even to an extremely experienced psychonaut, but he's got some really interesting lectures I would encourage you all to look up on YouTube. So the idea, again, of these dosages is that within that route of administration, again, being through the mouth and the digestive tract, I've heard recently in the last few years of people trying to inject psilocybin with really almost lethal consequences. Don't try it. Don't try mainlining it. That is, you're basically poisoning your blood. Routes of administration, smoking this also doesn't really, I've heard different accounts, but oral is the way to go with psilocybin. So the idea of being able to dry or have fresh, and again, differentiating, these dosages are dried grams, right? There's a different wetness that comes with fresh mushrooms. The idea that psilocybin lasts 3 to 8 hours, and it can be substantially different depending on the species. So my recommendation, the recommendation from Zendo Project and MAPS, start low, go slow. And the other piece I gotta tell you, from sitting for a lot of people that have accidentally found themselves in a headspace where they didn't think they were gonna go, is not all mushrooms are created equal. Pinus Envy is one that I've heard is a much more potent, and I've personally experienced the psilocybe cyanisis. It can be 4 times more potent, meaning that if I think I'm taking a microdose, I might be having a regular dose. If I think I'm taking 2 grams, I could be potentially getting into a heroic dose. So again, I'm going to go back. Start low, go slow. If you don't and have not had this strain before, if you're not familiar with the source, start low. There's something really pleasant about a low threshold psilocybin experience. There's something completely unpleasant if you're not expecting to have a heroic dose and you accidentally wind up there. So another piece I want to hit really quick, and I'm aware that we're nearing the end of time, and I got a few more slides, so I'm going to go through this quickly, is the idea of drug combinations. Now, there's an amazing resource called tripsit.me, and this is their guide to drug combinations. Again, I'm not going to go in on this. I know the resolution here isn't giving us the examination that we'd like to have of every drug across the board, but this is the tripsit.me drug combination chart, and it can be really helpful for anybody thinking about doing more than just psilocybin. Again, test your drugs. dancesafe.org can get yourself a test kit, test your drugs. All right, so I'm going to spend this last few minutes diving into emergencies. So again, the differentiation between challenge is something that we can deal with support, with a little bit of breath work. It's hard, it's not comfortable, but it's not life-threatening or threatening to our long-term mental well-being. Emergencies, on the other hand, are. And they're things that should be escalated to the right folks, the right professionals, and the right scope of service. When in doubt, seek professional care. I know this can be a really hard thing for some folks in our community, but at the end of the day, as difficult as it may be to go to the ER in the middle of a psilocybin trip, it's a much better avenue than someone you love dying from something that's maybe not even related to psilocybin, but exacerbated by the experience they're having, whether that's a heart attack, a stroke, or any of the other potential things that can be there. The other piece I want to remind us as a community, sometimes within our cohort or our sojourners, maybe there is a professional who's a nurse or a doctor or an EMT. But again, scope of service. Is this person sober? A doctor on 4 grams of psychedelics, or sorry, of psilocybin may not be, even though they're an amazing doctor, may not be the right person to talk to professionally evaluate what's actually going on. So we're going to dive a little bit more into this. The idea of, if you're finding yourself or the person that you're with in a medical emergency, a mental health emergency, or being violent or threatening harm to themselves or others, this is the time to immediately escalate to professional care. United States, call 911. If you're in another country, call the emergency services line and get help. These things range from injury, right? We're not always, especially on psilocybin, the most coordinated. So, you can injure yourself. There can be pain and agony, anything that's non-responsive. Get that help. Not only get the help immediately, but if you are first aid certified, provide that immediate medical first aid and life support as that is coming in. We're talking about hypothermia, hyperthermia, and hyponatremia, which is usually more from MDMA, but the idea of consuming too much water. Mental health emergencies, everything from paranoia, suicidal ideation, delusions, despair, and psychosis. Now, despair being that like next level of agony. And again, I want any of you to be able to make that call of who you're with or who you're supporting or yourself to be able to get that support immediately. Now, you can consider a medical welfare check. You can continue to provide support and reassurance. And again, with any of these situations, I want to encourage you all, this is what a good trip sitter does, is to be able to provide that support as deep as it needs to go. So if somebody needs to call 911, or if somebody is sober and can drive the affected person to the hospital, be there as their support. Be there alongside them every step of the way. That difference of being able to help folks through these situations, we've seen at Zendo Project, especially when friends are with, their people and they're having a medical emergency, there's nothing more reassuring than sending that entire group of friends over to the medical tent or the Rampart Field Hospital at Burning Man to know that they're there, that the people and the familiar faces are there every step of the way to help them through a mental health or a medical emergency. And finally, violence, sexual assault, or any other security emergency. Start by keeping yourself safe. Otherwise, you're going to become part of the problem. Call for law enforcement. Again, I understand we are part of a counterculture community here. There are just times where law enforcement is the best answer. I want you all to make that call on your own, understand your own value system and your own ethics, but what happens when somebody gets out of control, is not reading the situation properly, and then goes and finds themselves some sort of weapon and is attacking people that they love. These are not uncommon situations. And again, I'm not trying to scare us. I'm just trying to give us a real accurate picture of the outliers and the situations that we have seen and the situations that make the news. The more that we can do to protect our community and make the right calls when needed, the better this movement's going to be. So be safe, get others to safety, and where appropriate, keep the individual from causing harm to themselves or others. Finally, our community and our integration. I can't state this enough. This to me is one of the biggest parts of harm reduction. So mushrooms may not change your mind or solve your life, but community connection and peer support may be a more supportive and easeful path forward. So just remind yourselves, I know that sometimes in this day and age, finding like-minded human beings can be difficult, but have patience, we're out there. At the end of the day, maybe it's not psilocybin or psychedelics you need, but another human being to actually be peer support through the challenges that are going on this world and in this planet. So I'm going to remind us of the 4 principles for psychedelic peer support that we use every day at Zendo Project: creating a safe space, sitting, not guiding, talking through and not down, and difficult is not necessarily the same as bad. So these are all available on the Zendo Project website at zendoproject.org. You'll see those resources here at the end. And finally, the idea of our community as integration. So there, in my opinion, working with Zendo, working with MAPS, we find this beauty in reflecting our growth, holding us accountable, making relationships with all things, even the folks in the parts of ourselves we don't like. Drug experiences come and go, but true community will outlast the afterglow and the hype of a drug experience. The reminder, we as humans are social creatures. We need one another. We're not hyper-isolated. And the idea of witnessing trauma and emotional release can be cathartic and healing to all of us. So we build community at the speed of trust. So let's be patient and let's repair rather than ostracize. So this final one I'm going to share with you all, and it's going to be available in this PDF, but here are some of our resources. I know we're at time, and I just want to say thank you all so much for being a part of this. I'm going to stop the share.